a capacidade disso afetar também o Oriente Médio, né? Como que o Oriente Médio tem sido afetado por essas questões ligadas à crise na Ucrânia. Então, mais do que necessário, é também um prazer. Deixa eu diminuir aqui o meu som. Então, mais do que necessário, é um prazer para nós receber o professor Gabriel, que nos honra com sua presença, e dizer que é um prazer e que a casa é sua, que a gente possa recebê-lo muito mais vezes na nossa PUC Minas. Então, seja bem-vindo, Gabriel. Eu vou para a plateia para poder assistir a sua palestra e desejo você sucesso na sua fala. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado a você. Português não é bom para dar conferências ou aulas, então eu vou falar em inglês. I would first of all like to thank Professor Danida Regine for this opportunity given to me to teach in your university, which I enjoyed a lot. It's been a time of 1 month and a half, in which I to give some lectures on a number of issues related to the history of international relations. And I am happy that I could do this. And I have to tell you that it has been not only an opportunity to, for me to give some insights on a number of subjects, but also I have learned myself a lot, because it was also a contact between different research agendas, different research mentalities, different ways of approaching subjects of interest, of course, for myself and for my students. So we have to go through a subject of utmost importance. It's the Crimean, the new Crimean War, I would say, and its impact in the Middle East, which is not that, okay, thank you. Perfect. So it's kind of a more easy to speak in this way. So I don't have to keep this mic. And okay. So there's a wonderful opportunity to speak about the impact of the crisis in Ukraine on the Middle East. And I have to tell you that I have made some notes here. I have printed some material. I have done some research myself on this issue, but I am not going to read anything, or I'm not going to present anything that I have written, because I want to give you a fresh insight into this extremely interesting topic. And I have to tell you that my historical background gives me some hints and allows me to understand a little bit more on this topic. And what I mean by that, we're not gonna get a historical lecture here, but there is something that I have in my mind, which is related to Russia's foreign policy. So what are the features of the Russian foreign policy? What were the features of the Soviet foreign policy? Well, not gonna get through this in a deep way, but I would take this opportunity to analyze the Russian foreign policy from the perspective of uh, center-periphery relations. And it's probably you're aware of this Wallerstein theory, the theory of dependencies in world affairs, which is a theory that gives a lot of credit to the center-periphery relations. But I think in the case of Russia, analyzing its foreign policy from this perspective of center-periphery relations pays quite well. And if we do not take into consideration this this position of Russia in international affairs, we would not understand why Russia is moving to the Middle East. But basically, it's because Russia has an interesting position with respect to Europe. So one would ask, is Russia part of Europe? That could be a legitimate question if Russia is part of Europe. Well, we would definitely say Russia is part of Europe. The reasons for that is that Russia has a record of international treaties, especially from the 18th century onwards, towards nowadays, in which we see how Russia and Russian foreign policy impacted on Europe, and the impact was huge. We have the Napoleonic Wars, we have the First World War, we have the Second World War, and we have the unification of Germany, which is also an important event in more recent European history. The unification of Germany after the Second World War is quite an extraordinary event, which has been possible because Russia accepted that. So Russia is part of Europe, but at the same time, Russia is not part of Europe because Russia is not part of NATO for obvious reasons. It's obvious that Russia was not going to be part of NATO, although some people were interested in making Russia part of NATO because this was the only way to end the Cold War. So it was a kind of a crazy initiative almost 2 decades ago, which for a number of reasons did not have a chance to see it fulfilled. But it's obvious that Russia is not part of this military defensive alliance, and Russia is not involved in the European system defined by the European Union's treaties. So from the very beginning, the European Union did not have Russia among its members, although the European Union from its beginning was very sensitive to the evolution of the Cold War. So it's kind of a reality that Russia indirectly played a role for decades in the destiny of Europe, although not part of it in the normative sense. But this is kind of it's a situation that has historical roots. But it's not only the situation, the very peculiar situation in which Russia is in relation to Europe, that it's going to be in our focus today. It's also what we see, the so-called classical periphery of the international system, and the international system usually is synonymous to European system, basically. And there, Russia is also present. And Russia is present outside the European system, not for 20 or 30 years, not from the 60s or from the 70s, no. Russia is present there for like 250 years. What I mean by saying that is that Russia has a tradition that goes back, an Oriental, let's say Orientalistic tradition that goes back to the 18th century, at least. I'll say 18th century because in the 18th century, many features of the Russian Empire in the East have been well defined and have been there, and as a result of that, Russia was able to assert itself as a global power. It's very important because what we see today in terms of Russian entanglements in the Middle East is, for me as a historian, as a continuation of what once was the great game in Asia. But what was the great game in Asia, basically? You'd find various books, you'd find many materials on that, but basically, the great game in Asia was a rivalry, an extraordinary rivalry between Russia, the Russian Empire, and the British Empire. And this rivalry dated back to the 18th century when the Russians started to put pressure on the Islamic states and monarchies that were kind of an intermediate, constituted an intermediary body between the global South, maritime South, and the Russian Empire. What I mean by that is, I mean the Ottoman Empire, and in the first place. The second place, it was Iran, and then it was nowadays Afghanistan and India, basically, strictly geographically. Of course, the Russians extended towards the Pacific as well. We know that Russian territorial expansion included also Alaska, which has been offered to the United States. We're not entering into that, but what one should definitely understand that the Russians put a pressure on states which have been regarded in London as client states of the British, or states that could somehow constitute a barrier, a kind of a like a front line in order to stop, to contain the expansion, the territorial expansion of Russia. So basically, one would say that the British involvement in the Crimean War was the result of this strategy. And it has a very long history. Meant that the British support Iran for the fact that Iran lost a number of territories in the context of the Russian expansion, and also that the British support, as I said, Turkey, because Russia advanced into the Caucasus. So Russia was deeply involved in traditionally Islamic territories. We have to keep that in mind, because one factor that it is important up until today, you have to take into consideration that Russia today has, let's say, 10 or 12% of the population of Muslims, basically, and it's the involvement of because of the history of the Russian expansion towards the South Seas, the warm seas. So there is an explanation for Russia's interest for the Middle East today in this history that they had, and it's a very long history. We have to understand that the history, these relations among Russians and Islamic chieftains and other rulers from this extended Middle East have not always been conflictual. Basically, what the Russians were doing was in not much respect different from what the British were doing in India. What I mean by that is that the Russians tended to use techniques like indirect rule, for example, which meant that basically they provide security umbrellas to local leaders in order those leaders to fight their opponents in a broader political local context. So you have to keep that in mind. What the British were doing was not different at all. That is why the British were concerned about the interest that some rulers in the East have or could have in shifting, from the British to the Russian, which does not mean that automatically the Russians would have been received with open hands by those religious or secular, doesn't matter, the political leaders, let's not say secular because it has a different meaning, but still it's not this extended Middle East, it's not only a matter of British and Russian influence, it's also a matter of how these influences influence the local political game. We have to keep that in mind as well. So what is basically how one would define the Russian foreign policy? Which from these two, I mean, this European legacy of Russian foreign policy or this Oriental legacy of the Russian policy is more important for President Putin, for example, to bring things into nowadays context? Which dimension of this imperial legacy is more important to President Putin? Well, the answer is, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, they both matter. And of course, at some point, the Russians and the Russian diplomats, what I mean, and political key political figures, because we have to keep in mind that it's not only President Putin that thinks of foreign policy, it's an army of experts and policy makers that define this rather traditional foreign policy. So one would say that today the Russians have decided to go for the European dimension of their policy is the most important. And the reason for that is the outbreak of the Russian-Ukrainian war. So one would say that the Russians are out of the Middle East, basically, for a number of security concerns, because the crisis in Europe is so important that they would not be able to support. They will not be able to continue their initiatives in the Middle East. Well, it's too early. It's too early to say how how the Russian foreign policy will evolve. What we see is that the so-called low-cost Russian foreign policy is paying quite well, because what we see, and it's information available to everyone, there are a number of shifts in this context. One would say that basically, if the Russians are so busy in Ukraine, then they could be basically defeated on other fronts because they are no longer there. But it's not happening that way. What we see stagnation. We see status quo in the Middle East, at least in my opinion, what I see. And not only status quo, I see there is a kind of a, how could I, not like neutrality, but like a benevolent neutrality towards Russian-Ukraine conflict, in the sense that the situation is somehow good in the context of the Middle Eastern affairs, because it gives it shows that a number of key players, mainly US and Russia, they are not going to clash in the Middle East, which is actually, after the Abraham agreements, it's quite a good thing, which does not mean that the status quo is automatically a good thing for a number of players and subordinate players like the Palestinians and others, which are not in a good position. That's for sure. But we see that there is a kind of a general opinion that somehow this crisis in Europe should not be imported into the Middle East, because after the agreements with the Israelis, the recent evolutions, it's a kind of the Middle East is growing towards a kind of a subsystem of international relation. It doesn't mean that it's a fair subsystem, or if we're not talking in ethical terms here, we're talking about in terms of general peace. We see, for example, new evolutions, like the new Israeli Prime Minister going to visit President Putin. We see such evolutions, probably for a number of good reasons. For example, the fact that the Russians gave sophisticated anti-missile systems to President Assad in Syria meant that the Israelis should be more careful while trying to bomb positions in Syrian territory, because basically airplanes cost a lot of money, and it's not that should be used with more let's say, should be used with a lot of care, because resources are quite scarce. And in the end of the day, the regime in Syria, which is not a democratic regime by all means, it's not that, but is the question of democracy that important to the Middle East, or the status quo is more important, and to keep reasonable peace, you know, everyday peace is more, it's a task that needs more attention from the side of policymakers in the Middle East. So it's a kind of a attempt, from what, at least from what I see, it's kind of an attempt from these policymakers even in the broader Middle East, like the Saudis and like others, are trying to somehow stay away from this conflict. And not only that, I mean, there is also Turkey, an important actor. There's also Iran, an important actor, and they both have very good ties with Russia, which does not mean that they agree on all files on the table, but they keep contact, and they keep close contact, which mean that basically the Russians are, you know, supporting a new kind of deal for the Middle East, which is not yet to be seen, but we see that this evolution is basically on the move, in a context in which the US is rather diminishing its role in the region. So this is how I see. So I believe that for a number of good reasons, Russia would not make a mute profile in the Middle East, but I see for the next months an intensification, an active interest on behalf of active interest of Russia for finding a settlement for Ukraine, first of all. But on the other hand, we have to see things differently. If there won't be any settlement for Ukraine, then there is a lot of chance that European crisis is exported to the Middle East. There is also this perspective. We have to keep that in mind, that because when we're talking about center-periphery relations, it's not talking about separate worlds, but we are talking about interdependencies between center and periphery. And in the context in which we have a multiplication of power, centers of powers in the world, like China, for example, it's an important center of power in the broader international system. Then we see that there will be chance that crisis be exported to the Middle East. So, of course, it is too early. We are only projecting some ideas here, because history teaches us so. But definitely, I believe that there is a lot of insecurity. There is a lot of insecurity in the Middle East, I think, right now, on the ways in which the Ukrainian crisis would evolve. The more, if the conflict would extend, then it is possible that the Middle East would be inflamed as well. And we have seen how the US government was trying to impose new prices of oil in order to harm Russia, for obvious reasons, because Russia gets a lot of cash because of oil exports. So if the prices go down, basically the Russians are deprived of an important resource, which was not the case, because the Saudis and other players did not want to follow that move, and they knew they are able to take that step forward because they are in a very good position in the broader US security strategy, in the sense that the US could not impose at any cost a policy to the Gulf petromonarchies. It is impossible. So, and there are many, you could find online many analyses that say that the US should handle with care these relations with these monarchies, because the Russians are in a better position in these states, because Russians do not care much about human rights, whereas the Americans, not only that they want, pragmatic solutions to their policies, they expect pragmatic solutions and decision taken, but also they want to export their political culture, whereas the Russians are not interested in exporting any of their political culture. By the way, Russian political culture might be closer to some of these, to the political cultures of these states, which does not mean that they are basically pure. Russia is not a pure dictatorship. Basically, it would be a mistake. Historical, in historical terms, it would be a mistake that we consider Russia as, like Iran, Russia as Saudi Arabia. There are significant differences in political culture, but still there's a kind of a all these countries that lack interest in LGBT rights, for example. It's not a concern for the Saudis, the LGBT rights, neither for the Russian. They are not interested in, supporting this society-based agenda. They are just pragmatic, which represents a kind of a weak point for the US while trying to approach the Gulf states, because the US policy has also some of these features that include society projects as well. So it's a kind of, we are moving slowly to a new world order. And we see that not only from these evolution, but from other situations. For example, the way the European Union has evolved from this ambition of a new stakeholder in world affairs. The European Union transformed itself in a kind of a client political entity of NATO. They did not choose their own way, but they have chosen a way in which their individual position is less present in the eyes of many Europeans, and that is also a kind of an alignment that will have significant impact on world affairs, but that we don't know yet how things will evolve. So these are kind of suggestions that I was able to put forward in front of you, and I am ready to answer your questions and to discuss things that I have said here, and to open up, comments, and to new perspectives on this very hot topic, which of course is we are trying to get new information, because what the problem what we don't have yet enough reliable sources. So I am a historian, and I'm kind of obsessed with sources, with archives, with documents. What we have today is a number of public speeches, declarations. We can work with that, definitely. We have some data here and there, but we still don't have enough documents in terms of at least like the yellow books, these kind of a propaganda editions, which would include documents. So in order to be more imaginative while doing our comments, yet I don't think that it's. I think it's too early to basically have a significant, a strong point of view on the current affairs. But yet, let's probably from comments and debates, we would basically maybe try some new ideas, and to see how to transform these ideas in working hypotheses, because what we are interested basically here is not to give, to project the future, but to have some to work with credible hypotheses, and we have to build a strong hypothesis. And I hope that we together would build a strong hypothesis that you and I could use in our analysis and our scientific articles. So I'm definitely open to that. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Gabriel Leanca for your lecture, your analysis. I think we are living a very important moment in the global history. We, as a global South part, Brazil is part of this global South. We are living a kind of order changing. As you presented in your lecture, we are living a very challenging moment. And hear from you, it's a very interesting source, because it's not about a Brazilian view, but it's a Eastern European view that knows this old history between Europeans. As you said, Russia is Europe, or Russia is Asia, Eurasia. So in name of the Department of International Relations, and in behalf of the Middle East and Maghreb Research Group, once more, I'd like to thank you very much for your lecture. So, do you want to speak something? Yes.
Well, I would like to thank you too for this wonderful opportunity that was given to me speak about these subjects, and particularly to touch upon this hot topic. I hope I don't know if you guys understand that we are living historical moments. We're very quiet, kind of, we're calm. We're just taking these debates are intellectual debates. We can disagree, we can agree. We're calm, but the truth is that yes, we remember that in Europe, Belgrade was bombed by NATO. That could let's not forget that it was not only the Ukraine war, but still it's a new chapter in European history, basically. And there is this extreme power of tradition. If Europe is not doing well, the world is not doing well. So there is this, which I would tend to disagree at some point. Yes, I understand, and I come from Europe myself. Europe is definitely an important part of the world, but it's not the world in itself. We should keep that in mind as well. And Ukraine, it's not the center of the world. But the thing is that there is war in Europe, and that war includes very strong actors. On one side, Russia, and on the other hand, Ukraine. But Ukraine is not alone, as in during the Crimean War, the Ottomans were not, and they could not win a war against Russia, but they could win a war if they were supported by France and England. Nowadays, Ukraine could win, in theory, a war if they would be strongly supported by NATO countries. So when I say that it is a historical moment, I say that we have never seen yet. I mean, in our lives, our parents, yes, they remember the Second World War, or our grandfathers, they remember the First World War, Second World War, that period in the 30s, which was not in Europe a wonderful period of time. But now what we are experiencing today is kind of weaponization of Europe, basically. And that has not been seen since the early days of the Cold War. You have to keep in mind that it's a very, very important moment. And I think for you as students of international relations, now it's time to basically run to the library and find all books possible, and to do this research, because I know it may sound egoistic, but when you have such an opportunity in your lifetime to be part, to experience this intellectually only, because you're far away from the theater of hostilities. It's not a matter of being involved directly, of course not, but intellectually, it's an opportunity actually for you. And you have now time not only to look at this, what is happening, to watch the news and to read the online articles, so on and so forth, but also what you can do, and what you could do is actually to check which theories of international relations are more adequate in order to understand today's world. Because now it's also fact check. It's also a kind of you can check which one of these theories, which ideas can pass the test of time, because nowadays it's not only a zero moment for international relations, but also for international theory, international history of international relations, and all these disciplines that have been here for a number of decades. It's a kind of a restart for the disciplines as well. I don't know. You agree? You disagree? I don't know.
We will open for some questions. So if someone wants to make a question to Professor Gabriel.
Good morning, and I'd like to thank you for this amazing, fantastic lecture. I learned a lot about the Ukrainian crisis, but my question is a brief one, although the answer might be not so brief. Can you think on the other way around and think about what is the role of some Middle Eastern actors on Ukrainian crisis, and not only Middle Eastern actors, but also some of Islamic actors from other parts, like the Caucasus, in the Ukrainian crisis, and how Russia and Ukraine see this involvement and the involvement of these actors in Ukrainian crisis. Thank you.
You know, I think the Ukrainian crisis is for some, I think the Ukrainian crisis is kind of an opportunity. Now they can express themselves, and they can contribute to some extent to the everyday agenda of the conflict. Basically, they can. It's a kind of a alignment. Some align with Russia. Some prefer to be muted or to be more neutral. Well, the Caucasus, and it's a kind of it's not only the Caucasus, it's also Central Asia. It was Kazakhstan as well. Remember that before a number of months before the Ukrainian crisis, there was a political crisis in Kazakhstan, which has been quickly solved by a soft military intervention. And then you have the situation in the Caucasus. You have Nagorno-Karabakh, and you have Armenia, and you have Azerbaijan. That is a very interesting topic. But I think that the Russians advance as well there, because they are the most important guarantor of peace in the region. But they have shown the ability of not imposing something, a solution. They impose a solution, but not alone. They found some solutions, maybe not kind of settlement, but still, kind of an agreement somehow, by including Iran, by including Turkey in the general negotiations on the various topics that were on the table regarding the Caucasus. So that would, in my opinion, that would influence as well the dynamic of the affairs in the Middle East, because Iran and Turkey are also very important players in the Middle East. So what I mean by that is that Russia is building a number of it's kind of a system of treaties in which these countries take part in. So which means that while this country could be somehow isolated in world affairs from the Western perspective, they could gain visibility in world affairs by the ways in which Russia engages in world affair, by stimulating these important regional players which do not have a voice in world affairs because they are seen as the black sheeps, or for a number of reasons. Together with the fact that many of the Israelis today come from Russia, you would get a picture of how Russian influence will evolve in Middle Eastern affairs. I'm not sure that I answered to your question. I'm pretty sure there are some other things which I don't have enough knowledge about. How, for example, maybe you are interested in the ways in which non-state actors would be involved in the Ukrainian operations on the ground, or these kind of things. I have not much knowledge on that, and I'm very kind of I read with a lot of suspicion. I'm a historian, and I don't believe anyone. Kind of it's a good thing to be suspicious regarding what you read. But, sometimes if you go too deep into that suspicion, is not good. But I'm kind of because what we have seen, it's an informational war we are living in, and not what you see online you can really check. Yeah.
Any questions?
Good morning, Professor. I hope this question doesn't sound too shallow, because even though I have an interest in Middle Eastern affairs, it's not my research area. So I was thinking about the blockages of Russian products and things like gas on Europe, and how countries from Maghreb and Middle East can provide this kind of things to Europe right now. And the question I have is, do you see it as an opportunity for those countries to have a power balance shift, or maybe it's just a temporary thing or something like that? Thank you very much.
So I think it's a very, very interesting question. Look, I think that the cuts in gas supply to Europe from Russia, I think it was a huge mistake. I'll tell you why. Because the more you isolate Russia, if the European Union basically wants to isolate Russia from basically what they say the core of the international system, the more Russia will be present at the periphery of the international system, which, this was the topic of today. The more you exclude Russia from Europe, the more Russia will be present outside Europe and will harm and is actually harming European interests outside the Union. There was this idea in the 18th century. I'll tell you why I go back to history. I'm not gonna make a lecture right now, but what I want to say is that in the 18th century there was this idea how to tame down the beast. The beast was Russia. How to tame the uncivilized beast that Russia was seen as a beast. So there was the French had this idea that, we need the stick and the carrot. So the idea was that the Russians would depend on Europe basically through commerce and economic activity. Basically, the ports of southern Russia, today's Ukraine, would have been filled with European products and European cash, because Russia needed a lot of cash because they didn't have cash. But in doing that, they would control Russian foreign policy. So they would give a lot of cash through economic activity to Russia. They would integrate Russia in the world, in world affairs, world economic flows, and then the West would have some influence, have some say in the way Russian foreign policy is executed. You see? So now what we have? But basically, Russia is playing freely. So the more you cut the so-called Russian gas, did you ever number how many times in the press you find this expression Russian gas? But the gas is just gas. It's not Russian. It's just raw material. It's not. But they say Russian gas. But by saying that, they basically cut all ties between Russia and the rest of Europe, because we have to admit that Russia is basically part of the geographic Europe, at least a significant part of Russia, traditional part of Russia, is part of Europe. So that is cut. So what I see is that Europe is in a very difficult position on the long run, because liquid gas is very difficult to get from the United States, because you need a lot of technical capabilities, and you basically change one influence with another. Basically, the production of goods in Europe would be controlled according to the quantities of gas they have, in order to make those products and industrial goods. So it's kind of crazy. I think that there are many opportunities for countries outside the European Union, and this is something that you would be interested to research, because there will be I think it will be a lot of change. But I do not think that with respect to oil, for example, because with respect to oil, it's also the OPEC. You have to take that institution into consideration as well. So the idea is not to basically decrease the prices of oil, because also oil is raw material and it's not indefinite. So there are, I mean, it's not, and that we have seen that the petromonarchies in the Gulf are not just, to put it bluntly, hungry for money. You know, it's not that, but it's also to build in the Gulf states sustainable economies, not based only on oil. So this is also a very important aspect of, and we have to take into consideration, in my opinion, how the states in the Gulf change slowly. Of course, not it's not Russia as well is trying to move away from this dependency with respect to oil and raw materials. You know, they're trying to be more imaginative in terms of in economic terms, in order to have a different way of building the budget, the internal budget. So it's a kind of it's a very complex situation, and I think from this respect we will see many evolutions in the following years, not tomorrow, but in the following years. Yes, we will see, but of course we will have to keep an eye on China as well, because what we didn't talk about today is how China influences the game in the broader Middle East, because that is also a topic of a very interesting topic as well. I think it's thank you.
More questions? So I will do a last question to Professor Gabriel. In your opinion, do you believe that the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia could change with the Ukrainian crisis? We can see an impact in this relationship in reason of this probable order changing?
The answer is I don't know. What I think is that it's not the rivalry will still be there. It's not that it's not, you know, the signing of a broad cooperation treaty between the Saudis and Iran. It's not that. It's status quo and finding good intermediaries in order to solve existing problems. So this is how I see the relationship between the two. What intermediaries mean? Well, that could be Russia, for example. Russia could be an intermediate actor between the two rivalries, not to bring a new settlement to the Middle East, but to have some sort of a control over non-state actors that benefit from exclusive relationships with these important regional powers. So I think it could be taken into consideration, but it's not. We're because if the war in Ukraine will become in a couple of months an open war between NATO and Russia, well, the situation will be very different. And I think that in that case, it will just freeze. It will just freeze, because the war in Europe on that scale would be something something inconceivable. But I think that the Russians have the ability of becoming partners in trilateral, in talks, in negotiations regarding particular matters, not broad matters, not general. They will not do it. But who would have taken seriously a diplomatic initiatives between an Arab important state and the Israeli state? Who would would have given a chance 5 years ago, 10 years ago, to a dialogue between the Arab states and the Israelis because of the Palestinian issue? Who would? But yes, it was possible. Yes, it was possible, because it was a way of bringing some people on the table and establishing contacts that meant a lot in security terms for the broader Middle East. So why not see Iran part of this greater game in Asia? Because while engaging in talks, then it means that Iran backs up, steps back from some initiatives. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible. This is how I would think of, but definitely it depends on many aspects, including the there could be provocation as well, because, and I will finish with that, but I have to remind you that before the Crimean crisis, maybe nobody remembers, but there was a Putin-Biden meeting in Geneva. Do you remember that meeting? Is anybody remembering that meeting? It was before the talks that were held in Geneva as well, between the Russians and the Americans. And the result of that was a protocol, which was not, there was not much agreement on that, but still there was something. Anyway.
So let's see if Professor Gabriel is learning well Portuguese now. Muito obrigado, professor Gabriel, pela sua palestra. Muito agradecido pela oportunidade de ouvi-lo. E agradecido também à audiência aqui presente, aqueles que nos acompanham também pelo YouTube, pelas redes sociais. A casa é sempre sua, as portas estão sempre abertas, esperamos que você possa contribuir cada vez mais com o seu conhecimento para a nossa área de estudo aqui na PUC Minas e nas relações internacionais. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much for this wonderful period of time that has been offered to me by the Pontifical University, and I am very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to contribute to the program, and I will be happy to contribute in the future to the program if occasion will be, and time will allow us to be together again and to work and talk about these wonderful topics that are on the agenda today. Thank you.